On the French side, the preparations for disaster were already well advanced. In late 1915, the French High Command had made a decision that would prove catastrophic. They had systematically stripped Verdun's fortresses of their heavy guns. The logic was defensible on paper, the fortress guns were needed elsewhere along the front, and the prevailing military doctrine held that fortresses were obsolete in modern warfare anyway. The great concrete forts of Verdun, Fort Douaumont, Fort Vaux, Fort Sauville, sat largely ungarrisoned, their gun emplacements empty or undermanned, their defensive value dramatically reduced. Verdun's sector commander, General Her, was alarmed. He sent repeated warnings to the French High Command that his position was dangerously undermanned and that Verdun was vulnerable to a major attack. Those warnings were noted and largely ignored. The French High Command was focused on planning their own offensives for 1916. Verdun, they believed, was quiet. It would stay quiet. It would not stay quiet. The German bombardment of Verdun began at 7:15 in the morning on February 21, 1916. What opened that morning was not like anything the Western Front had yet experienced, and the Western Front had experienced some extraordinary violence by that point. Over 1,200 German guns opened simultaneously along a front of just 8 miles. A concentration of artillery that was almost incomprehensible in its density. The French positions that had been thinly held, poorly reinforced, and stripped of their heavy guns, simply disintegrated under the weight of fire. Woods that had stood for centuries were reduced to splinters in hours. Villages that had survived multiple previous wars were erased from the landscape in minutes. The French soldiers sheltering in the forward positions had no meaningful shelter against a bombardment of this scale. They could only press themselves into the earth and wait for it to stop, and it did not stop. For 9 hours, the guns fired without pause. And then the German infantry advanced. What they found in the French forward positions was not resistance. It was devastation. French soldiers who had survived the bombardment emerged from their shelters in states of complete psychological collapse. Some unable to speak, some unable to move, some who had simply lost contact with reality entirely under the 9 hours of continuous shellfire. The German infantry, using new infiltration tactics rather than the traditional wave assaults that had proved so costly on the Somme, pushed forward rapidly. By the end of the first day, the German advance had penetrated further into enemy territory than almost any single day's fighting on the Western Front since the trenches had formed. And then something happened that nobody, not Falkenhayn, not the French High Command, not the soldiers on either side, had fully anticipated. Fort Douaumont fell. Fort Douaumont was the largest and most formidable of Verdun's ring of protective fortresses. Built of reinforced concrete several meters thick, designed to withstand the heaviest bombardment, it was supposed to be the anchor of Verdun's defense. On February 25, just 4 days into the battle, a small patrol of German pioneers, no more than a few dozen men, entered the fort and found it almost completely unoccupied. The garrison had been reduced to a skeleton crew. The heavy guns had been removed. The great fortress, the symbol of French military might, was taken by a handful of men in a few hours without a significant fight. The news hit France like a physical blow. In Paris, there was panic. In the newspapers, there was outrage. In the French High Command, there was the dawning, horrifying realization that Falkenhayn's trap had been perfectly set and France had walked directly into it. Verdun could not be allowed to fall. Verdun would not be allowed to fall, whatever it cost, however many men it took. France would hold Verdun or France would cease to exist as a nation that believed in itself. General Philippe Pétain was given command of the Verdun sector on February 26. He was, by the standards of First World War generals, something unusual, a man who genuinely cared about the lives of his soldiers, who believed that men's lives should not be wasted unnecessarily, and who understood instinctively that the psychological dimension of this battle was as important as the physical one. His first act on arriving at Verdun was to organize the supply lines. Because Verdun had one critical vulnerability, it was connected to the rest of France by only one road and one narrow-gauge railway. Everything, every shell, every rifle, every loaf of bread, every replacement soldier, had to come in along that one road. Pétain turned that road into something remarkable. He organized a continuous convoy system that would eventually move 75,000 men and 50,000 tons of supplies along it every week. French soldiers called it La Voie Sacrée, the sacred way. It was the lifeline that kept Verdun alive. And Pétain used it not just for supplies but for men, rotating French divisions in and out of the Verdun sector on a regular basis, ensuring that no single unit spent too long in the meat grinder before being pulled back to rest and recover. This rotation system was both Verdun's salvation and its curse, because it meant that over the course of the battle, an extraordinary proportion of the entire French army passed through Verdun. Estimates suggest that by the end of the battle, over 70% of all French divisions had served at Verdun at some point, which meant that the psychological trauma of Verdun, the specific, particular horror of what it was like to fight there, was not confined to one corner of the French army. It spread. It infected almost everything. What was it like to fight at Verdun? The numbers tell part of the story. By the end of February alone, French casualties were running at several thousand men per day. But the numbers cannot capture the specific quality of what Verdun did to the men who fought there. The battlefield itself, after weeks of continuous bombardment, had been transformed into something that barely resembled Earth. The landscape had been churned so completely by artillery fire that it no longer had recognizable features. Woods had become fields of splintered stumps. Villages had disappeared entirely, not ruined, not damaged, literally erased, their locations identifiable only on maps. The ground itself had been turned over so many times by shells that it had become a gray-brown lunar surface of overlapping craters, many of them filled with water, some of them filled with the remains of men who had died in previous attacks and been buried by subsequent shellfire and then exposed again by the shells that came after. The smell of Verdun was something that survivors described for the rest of their lives, something that had no name, the specific smell of a landscape that had been saturated with death for months at a time. Men who fought at Verdun reported that the smell never entirely left them. Decades later, they could still bring it back simply by closing their eyes. And through all of this, through the bombardment that never truly stopped, through the landscape that no longer looked like anything on Earth, through the smell and the mud and the rats and the fear, the battle continued. Week after week, month after month. By March, the German offensive was already starting to slow. The initial breakthrough had not been exploited quickly enough. French resistance had stiffened. Pétain's supply system was working. The German infantry, fighting over ground that their own artillery had made almost impassable, was struggling to maintain momentum. Falkenhayn began to realize that his plan was not unfolding as designed. France was not breaking. France was bleeding, but so was Germany. In April, the Germans shifted their main axis of attack, pushing toward the west bank of the Meuse River to try to silence the French artillery that was causing devastating casualties among German troops. The fighting on the west bank, at hills known to the soldiers simply as Le Mort Dead Man's Hill, and Hill 304, was as terrible as anything happening on the east bank. The battle had expanded beyond its original boundaries,